Captain Sarah "Thunder" Martinez had always been different from other pilots. Growing up on a ranch in Arizona, she learned to fly crop dusters before she could legally drive a car. Her grandfather, a Navajo code talker from World War II, taught her that the sky belonged to those brave enough to claim it. When she joined the military at 18, everyone expected her to wash out of flight school within weeks. They were wrong. Sarah's reputation in the Apache helicopter program was legendary. She could make the massive attack helicopter dance through mountain valleys like a hummingbird, striking targets with surgical precision that left even seasoned instructors speechless. Her call sign, Thunder, came from her habit of appearing out of nowhere during training exercises, devastating enemy positions before vanishing into the landscape. Fellow pilots joked that she had supernatural abilities, but Sarah knew the truth was simpler. She understood her machine like it was an extension of her own body. The day everything changed started like any other mission briefing. Sarah sat in the cramped briefing room at Forward Operating Base Phoenix, listening to intelligence reports about insurgent activity in the eastern mountains. Her Apache, tail number 07030058, sat on the tarmac outside, loaded with Hellfire missiles and ready for action. The mission seemed routine: provide close air support for a ground convoy moving through a known hostile area. What the briefing officers didn't mention was the experimental jamming equipment the enemy had recently acquired. As Sarah lifted off into the desert morning, her communications began experiencing strange interference. Radio chatter turned to static, then silence. Her navigation systems flickered between normal readings and complete chaos. For the first time in her career, Sarah felt truly alone in the sky. The convoy she was supposed to protect had vanished from her instruments. Ground control was unreachable. Even her wingman's Apache had disappeared from radar, though she could see it clearly flying alongside her. Sarah realized that something was terribly wrong when she noticed civilian aircraft in the distance suddenly changing course, as if they were being directed away from her location. Unknown to Sarah, her Apache's transponder was broadcasting an identification code that had been compromised by enemy hackers. On radar screens hundreds of miles away, her helicopter appeared to be a hostile aircraft piloted by insurgents who had somehow stolen American military equipment. The misidentification triggered an automated alert system that sent shockwaves through military command centers across 3 time zones. Within minutes, Sarah's routine support mission had escalated into a full-scale military emergency. Fighter jets were scrambling from 2 different air bases. Guided missile systems were coming online, and satellite surveillance was being redirected to track what everyone believed was a stolen Apache helicopter in enemy hands. The irony was devastating. One of America's most skilled pilots had become the target of her own military's overwhelming firepower. As Sarah continued flying toward her original mission objective, completely unaware of the storm gathering around her, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Contrails were forming high above her position, and they were definitely not from commercial aircraft. The distinctive twin trails could only come from military fighter jets, and they were descending rapidly toward her location. For a moment, she wondered if backup had arrived early. That moment of confusion would prove to be the most dangerous of her entire military career. Sarah's training had prepared her for enemy fighters, mechanical failures, and ground-based threats. But nothing could have prepared her for the realization that her own side was about to open fire on her. The radio crackled with one brief transmission before cutting to static again. Unidentified Apache, you are in violation of restricted airspace. Respond immediately or we will engage. Sarah tried desperately to respond, but her communications equipment had been completely compromised by the enemy jamming. She was flying blind, deaf, and now hunted by the very forces she had sworn to serve. The fighter jets circled above like mechanical vultures, their pilots receiving orders to neutralize what they believed was a serious threat to national security. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test everything Sarah had learned about flying, fighting, and survival. Miles above the desert floor, 2 sides of the same military were about to engage in combat, neither knowing the true identity of their opponent. Sarah's laughter, when it finally came, would echo across the heavens for reasons no one could have predicted. The first missile lock alarm screamed through Sarah's headset like a banshee. Years of combat training kicked in automatically as she threw her Apache into a violent, evasive maneuver, diving toward the canyon floor at a speed that would have terrified most pilots. The massive helicopter responded to her touch like a living thing, rolling inverted and pulling negative gravity forces that pressed her hard against her restraints. Above her, the lead fighter pilot watched in amazement as the supposedly stolen Apache performed maneuvers that defied everything he knew about helicopter capabilities. Major Rick Viper Johnson had shot down enemy aircraft in 3 different conflicts, but he had never seen flying like this. The Apache pilot wasn't just evading his missiles. They were turning the helicopter into a weapon of pure aerial artistry. Sarah's mind raced through her options as she weaved between towering rock formations. The jamming was still blocking her communications, but her defensive systems were working perfectly. She could see the fighter jets pursuing her, their sleek forms cutting through the desert air like silver bullets. More concerning was the fact that she recognized the aircraft markings. These weren't enemy fighters. They were American F-16s from the 388th Fighter Wing. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Somehow her own military was hunting her. The equipment malfunction had obviously caused some kind of misidentification, but knowing the cause didn't solve her immediate problem. Those pilots above her had been ordered to shoot her down, and they would follow those orders unless she could find a way to prove her identity. Sarah's grandfather had once told her that a true warrior finds strength in laughter, even in the face of death. The memory of his weathered face and gentle smile sparked something deep in her chest. Here she was, one of the most advanced attack helicopters in the world, being chased by fighter jets through the same desert where her ancestors had once ridden horses. The absurdity of the situation struck her as almost cosmic in its irony. The second missile fired without warning. Sarah saw the smoke trail streak past her canopy as she yanked the Apache into another impossible turn. The Sidewinder missile, designed to destroy fast-moving jets, couldn't adjust quickly enough for her erratic helicopter movements. It impacted harmlessly against a cliff face, sending a shower of rock fragments cascading into the valley below. Major Johnson's frustration was evident in his radio communications to his wingman. These stolen Apache pilots were showing skills that rivaled the best military aviators he had ever encountered. His orders were clear: neutralize the threat. But something about this engagement felt wrong. Enemy pilots didn't usually demonstrate such intimate knowledge of American evasive tactics. Sarah realized that running wasn't going to solve her problem. The fighters had speed and altitude advantages that would eventually wear down her fuel reserves. She needed to do something unexpected, something that would force the pursuing pilots to question their mission. Her eyes fell on her weapon systems, still fully armed and functional despite the communications breakdown. The idea that formed in her mind was either brilliant or completely insane. Sarah banked hard to the right, climbing rapidly out of the canyon toward higher ground. To the fighter pilots above, it appeared that their target was finally making a run for it. They adjusted their pursuit angle, preparing for what they assumed would be the final engagement. What Sarah did next would be discussed in military academies for decades to come. Instead of continuing her climb to escape altitude, she suddenly flipped the Apache upside down and dove straight toward the lead fighter jet. The maneuver was so unexpected, so completely contrary to every rule of air combat, that Major Johnson barely had time to register what was happening. For 3 seconds, the two aircraft flew directly at each other in a deadly game of chicken. Sarah could see the pilot's face through his canopy, could see the moment when recognition dawned in his eyes. She wasn't some terrorist flying a stolen helicopter. She was a professional military aviator with skills that matched or exceeded his own. At the last possible moment, both aircraft broke away from their collision course. Sarah rolled her Apache right, while Major Johnson pulled his F-16 into a steep left turn. The near miss was so close that the two aircraft's wingtips nearly touched. But in that brief moment of proximity, something crucial had been communicated between the two pilots. Sarah climbed away from the encounter and did something that would become legendary among military aviators. She opened her communications channel to the emergency frequency and began laughing, not the bitter laugh of someone facing death, but the genuine, joyful laughter of someone who had just pulled off the impossible. The sound transmitted clearly through the static, reaching every military communication center monitoring the engagement. That laughter changed everything. Major Johnson had heard many sounds over his combat radio: screams of wounded soldiers, urgent tactical communications, the last words of dying pilots. But he had never heard an enemy combatant laugh with such pure, infectious joy in the middle of a dogfight. The sound made him question everything he thought he knew about this mission. The laughter echoing through the radio frequencies reached Command Central at exactly 14:32 hours. General Patricia Hayes, a veteran of 4 combat deployments, was monitoring the situation from her underground bunker 300 miles away. She had been watching the engagement unfold on multiple satellite feeds, growing increasingly concerned about the unusual tactics being displayed by both sides. General Hayes had seen Sarah Martinez's service record. She knew that Thunder was one of the finest Apache pilots in the entire military. When the misidentification alert had triggered the fighter response, Hayes had immediately tried to call off the engagement. But the communication jamming was affecting military frequencies as well, and her orders weren't getting through to the combat zone. The moment Sarah's laughter came through the speakers, General Hayes felt her blood turn to ice. She recognized that voice. More importantly, she recognized the call sign that had been obscured by the jamming. The supposedly stolen Apache was being piloted by one of their own elite aviators, and they had just tried to shoot her down. Meanwhile, high above the desert, Major Johnson was experiencing his own moment of clarity. He had noticed something during the near collision that his combat-focused mind had initially missed. The Apache pilot had deliberately revealed her face during the closest approach. Female pilots were rare enough in any military branch, but there was something familiar about those features. Johnson's wingman, Captain Lisa Raven Torres, had been following the engagement with growing unease. As a fellow helicopter pilot before transitioning to fighters, she understood aircraft capabilities better than most. The evasive maneuvers they had witnessed were beyond anything she had ever seen from enemy forces. More telling was the pilot's obvious familiarity with American tactical doctrine. Sarah continued her aerial dance, staying just ahead of the fighters while her mind worked frantically to solve the communication problem. The jamming was sophisticated, but it wasn't perfect. She had noticed brief moments when signals seemed to break through. If she could time her transmission just right, she might be able to get a message through to someone who could call off the attack. The desert landscape below told its own story. The original convoy she was supposed to protect had taken shelter in a rocky outcropping, their vehicles hidden from aerial view. Unknown to anyone in the air, the convoy's commanding officer had been trying desperately to reach higher command about the missing Apache support. His radio operator had been monitoring the emergency frequencies and had heard everything. Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, the convoy's communications specialist, was a former aircraft mechanic who recognized engine sounds the way other people recognized voices. When he heard the distinctive rotor signature through his headset, he knew immediately that the aircraft being pursued was an Apache. More importantly, he knew it was their Apache, the one that was supposed to be protecting them. Rodriguez began broadcasting on every frequency he could access, trying to reach anyone in the military command structure who would listen. His message was simple but urgent. The aircraft being engaged by friendly fighters was not enemy-controlled, but was actually their assigned close air support that had gone missing due to communication failures. Back in the sky, Sarah had made a decision that would either save her life or end it spectacularly. She was going to attempt something that had never been tried in combat, using her Apache's weapon systems to communicate instead of destroy. The Hellfire missiles she carried were designed to lock onto laser designations, but they could also be used to paint targets without firing. Sarah began using her targeting laser to write letters in the sky, projecting them onto cloud formations where the fighter pilots could see them. The first letter was a large U followed by an S. The message was taking shape. U.S. Army Apache 07030058, Captain Martinez. Major Johnson watched in fascination as the laser messages appeared and disappeared in the clouds above. The technical skill required to write legible letters using a targeting system while flying evasive maneuvers was beyond anything he had imagined possible. But more importantly, the serial number being projected matched the missing aircraft from their intelligence briefing. The pieces of the puzzle were finally coming together. Captain Torres had remembered where she had seen that face before. Sarah Martinez had been featured in a military aviation magazine just 6 months earlier, profiled as one of the rising stars in the Apache program. The woman they had been trying to shoot down was not only American military, but was considered one of the best pilots in her field. General Hayes received the convoy's radio transmission at the same moment her intelligence staff confirmed the aircraft identification. The Apache being pursued was indeed the missing close air support aircraft, and Captain Martinez was exactly where she was supposed to be, according to her flight plan. The only problem was that enemy jamming had created a perfect storm of misidentification and communication failure. The order to break off the engagement went out immediately, but the communication problems that had started the crisis were still affecting command frequencies. General Hayes watched helplessly as her orders struggled to reach the fighters through the electronic interference. Time was running out, and she could see on her satellite feeds that the engagement was escalating rather than ending. Sarah, unaware that help was on the way, had decided to take even more drastic action. Her grandfather had taught her that sometimes the best defense was an overwhelming offense. She was about to demonstrate why the Apache had earned its reputation as one of the most feared aircraft in the world. But instead of using her weapons to destroy, she was going to use them to create the most spectacular aerial display anyone had ever witnessed. The sky was about to erupt, but not in the way anyone expected. Sarah armed her defensive countermeasures and began the most audacious aerial demonstration in military history. Instead of using her flares to confuse incoming missiles, she started deploying them in precise patterns across the sky. Each magnesium flare burned at 3,000 degrees, creating brilliant white points of light that hung in the air like temporary stars. The display was breathtaking. Sarah choreographed her Apache through a series of barrel rolls and spirals, leaving trails of burning flares in geometric patterns that spelled out messages across the desert sky. From the ground, it looked like a celestial fireworks show. From the air, the fighter pilots could read her call sign and unit designation written in fire across the heavens. Major Johnson had never seen anything like it. The pilot below him was turning military ordnance into art, transforming weapons of war into instruments of communication. Each flare pattern was more complex than the last, demonstrating a level of skill and creativity that redefined what he thought possible in aerial combat. Captain Torres was frantically trying to reach command on her radio, desperate to confirm what they were all beginning to suspect. The jamming was still interfering with long-range communications, but she managed to get through to a regional air traffic control center. The controller confirmed what the laser messages had already suggested. They were engaging their own aircraft. Down in the convoy, Sergeant Rodriguez watched the flare display with growing excitement. He had served with Apache units before, and recognized the signature style of only one pilot. Captain Martinez was famous for her precision flying, but this demonstration exceeded even her legendary reputation. She was communicating through pure aerial artistry. Sarah's fuel gauge was dropping into the warning zone, but she wasn't finished with her performance. She had one more trick that would either convince the fighter pilots of her identity or provide her with an escape route. The Apache carried smoke grenades designed for marking landing zones, but Sarah had discovered they could be used for another purpose entirely. She began releasing colored smoke in a specific sequence: red, white, blue, then red again. To most observers, it might have seemed like random colors, but any American military pilot would recognize the pattern. It was the same sequence used in formation flying demonstrations, a signature of American air shows that had been performed for decades at military bases across the country. The smoke trails created rainbow arcs across the desert landscape as Sarah flew through her own colored clouds. The visual effect was stunning, but the message was clear. Only an American pilot would know the precise sequence and timing required for that particular demonstration. Enemy forces might steal aircraft, but they couldn't steal decades of military tradition and training. Major Johnson made the decision that probably saved both their lives. Against direct orders to maintain engagement, he called off his attack and began flying in formation with the Apache. His wingman followed suit, and suddenly the three aircraft were flying together instead of fighting each other. The unofficial ceasefire allowed for one crucial development: close-range radio communication. At less than a mile separation, some radio frequencies could penetrate the jamming. Sarah's voice came through clearly for the first time since the engagement began. "Viper, this is Thunder. I think we need to talk." The use of proper call signs and radio protocol immediately confirmed what the aerial display had already suggested. The conversation that followed was tense but productive. Sarah explained the communication failure and her original mission parameters. Major Johnson described the alert that had triggered their scramble and the misidentification that had created the entire crisis. Both pilots realized they had been victims of sophisticated enemy electronic warfare, but their problems were far from over. The jamming that had started the crisis was still active, and now they had lost contact with their respective command structures. Worse, Sarah's fuel situation was becoming critical. The extended evasive maneuvers and aerial demonstration had consumed more fuel than her mission profile had allowed for. The nearest friendly base was 40 minutes away, longer than Sarah's remaining fuel would last. Emergency landing sites in the desert were few and dangerous for a helicopter as complex as an Apache. The irony was cruel. Having survived being hunted by her own side, Sarah might still lose her aircraft to something as mundane as fuel exhaustion. Major Johnson proposed a solution that was as risky as it was unprecedented. His F-16 carried external fuel tanks that could be jettisoned in an emergency. While the fuel wasn't compatible with helicopter engines, the tanks themselves could be used as improvised landing beacons to mark a safe landing zone in the desert below. Sarah studied the terrain below, looking for any flat area large enough to accommodate an emergency landing. The desert landscape was treacherous, filled with hidden ravines and soft sand that could trap or destroy her aircraft. But she had spotted something promising, an old mining road that appeared to run straight for several miles across relatively flat ground. The plan they devised was dangerous but possible. Major Johnson would drop his external fuel tanks to mark both ends of the improvised runway. Captain Torres would circle overhead to provide visual guidance and radio communication with any approaching rescue forces. Sarah would attempt a controlled landing on the mining road, hoping that the surface was solid enough to support her aircraft's weight. As Sarah began her approach to the improvised landing site, she realized that the jamming interference was finally beginning to weaken. Scattered radio transmissions were breaking through, including what sounded like orders to break off the engagement. Help was apparently on the way, but it might arrive too late to prevent an emergency landing. The mining road looked even more challenging from low altitude. Sarah could see rocks, deep ruts, and patches of soft sand that could destroy her landing gear or flip the helicopter, but she had run out of alternatives. Her fuel gauges were reading empty, and her engines were beginning to show the first signs of fuel starvation. What happened next would be talked about in military circles for years to come. Sarah's emergency landing became an accidental masterpiece of precision flying that turned a potential disaster into a triumph of skill over circumstances. Sarah's approach to the mining road was a masterclass in emergency aviation. She came in low and slow, using every technique her grandfather had taught her about reading the land from above. The old Navajo had shown her how to spot firm ground versus soft sand, how to identify hidden obstacles, and how to judge distances without instruments. The Apache's engines began to sputter as the last drops of fuel reached the combustion chambers. Sarah had perhaps 30 seconds of power remaining, and she was still 50 feet above the ground. Most pilots would have attempted a standard auto-rotation landing, allowing the helicopter to descend with unpowered rotors. But Sarah had a better idea. She used her remaining engine power to execute a technique called a running landing, touching down while still moving forward at nearly 30 miles per hour. The landing gear contacted the hard-packed dirt road with a thunderous impact that sent dust clouds billowing in all directions. The Apache bounced twice, settled, and rolled to a stop just as the engines died completely. Major Johnson, circling overhead, watched the landing with professional admiration. He had seen countless emergency landings during his career, but nothing compared to the precision and control Sarah had demonstrated. She had set down a 20,000-pound attack helicopter on a dirt road with the delicacy of a bird landing on a branch. Captain Torres was the first to re-establish communication with command. The jamming had finally ended, apparently shut down by special operations forces who had located and destroyed the enemy equipment. Her radio crackled to life with urgent transmissions from General Hayes, demanding status reports and confirmation that all American aircraft were safe. The relief in General Hayes's voice was evident when she learned that the engagement had ended without casualties. The near disaster had been averted by quick thinking, exceptional flying skills, and a healthy dose of luck. But the general knew that the incident would trigger a comprehensive review of communication security and identification protocols. Sarah climbed out of her Apache and surveyed the desert landscape around her. The helicopter sat in the middle of the mining road like a giant metallic insect, its rotors slowly spinning to a stop. Despite everything that had happened, she felt a surge of pride in her aircraft. The Apache had performed flawlessly even under the most extreme circumstances. The fighter jets continued circling overhead, their pilots now serving as protectors rather than pursuers. Major Johnson coordinated with incoming rescue helicopters while Captain Torres maintained communication with the stranded convoy. The military machine that had nearly destroyed one of its own was now working efficiently to ensure everyone's safety. Sergeant Rodriguez and his convoy arrived at the landing site within an hour, their vehicles kicking up clouds of dust as they approached the grounded Apache. The convoy's medic checked Sarah for injuries while the communications specialist worked to establish a secure link with command headquarters. Everyone wanted to understand how such a dangerous misunderstanding had occurred. The enemy jamming operation, they learned, had been more sophisticated than anyone had realized. Foreign intelligence services had apparently been monitoring American military communications for months, learning call signs, frequencies, and identification codes. When they activated their jamming equipment, they had simultaneously broadcast false identification signals that made Sarah's Apache appear hostile on radar screens. Sarah's survival had depended on more than just flying skills. Her ability to think creatively under pressure, to use weapon systems for communication rather than destruction, and to maintain her sense of humor in the face of mortal danger, had all contributed to the successful resolution. The laughter that had echoed across the radio frequencies had become a symbol of resilience and ingenuity. The rescue operation that followed was a logistical masterpiece. Heavy-lift helicopters arrived to extract Sarah's Apache from the desert, while tanker aircraft provided fuel for the fighter escorts. Within 6 hours, all personnel and equipment had been safely recovered. The mining road where Sarah had landed was quickly swept for any sensitive debris. Major Johnson requested permission to visit Sarah before she was debriefed by intelligence officers. The two pilots met beside the grounded Apache, sharing the mutual respect that exists between warriors who have faced death together. Johnson admitted that he had learned more about flying in the past few hours than in his previous 10 years of military service. Sarah's grandfather had once told her that every challenge was an opportunity to discover hidden strengths. As she looked at her Apache being prepared for transport, she realized that the day's events had revealed capabilities she never knew she possessed. The crisis had forced her to innovate, to communicate through action rather than words, and to find solutions that existed outside normal training parameters. The investigation that followed would reveal systematic vulnerabilities in military communication systems. Sarah's experience would lead to new protocols for aircraft identification and emergency communication procedures. But more importantly, her story would inspire a new generation of pilots to think beyond conventional tactics. The desert sun was setting as the last rescue helicopter departed, carrying Sarah back to her base. She looked down at the mining road where her Apache had landed, now empty except for tire tracks in the sand. Tomorrow the wind would erase even those marks, leaving no trace of the day when the sky had erupted with flares and laughter, and one pilot's creativity had prevented a tragedy that could have changed military aviation forever. The official reports would focus on technical failures and procedural improvements. But among pilots, the story would be remembered differently, as the day Thunder Martinez turned a dogfight into an aerial ballet and proved that sometimes the most powerful weapon in a pilot's arsenal is the ability to make others laugh in the face of the impossible. 6 months after the incident, Sarah Martinez stood before a packed auditorium at the Air Force Academy, delivering a lecture on innovative problem-solving in combat situations. The story of her aerial encounter had become required reading in military academies worldwide, studied not just for its technical aspects but for its lessons about creativity under pressure. The investigation had revealed the full scope of the enemy's electronic warfare capabilities. Foreign intelligence services had been conducting a sophisticated campaign to disrupt American military communications, using captured equipment and months of surveillance to create convincing false signals. Sarah's aircraft had been the first to encounter the new jamming technology, making her an unwitting test case for enemy capabilities. General Hayes had personally recommended Sarah for the Distinguished Flying Cross, citing her exceptional airmanship and innovative use of available resources to prevent a friendly fire incident. The award ceremony had been attended by pilots from multiple branches of service, all eager to meet the woman who had turned defensive flares into a communication system and survived, being hunted by her own military. Major Johnson and Captain Torres had also received commendations for their restraint and professionalism during the engagement. Johnson's decision to break off the attack despite direct orders had prevented a catastrophic loss of life and equipment. Torres's efforts to re-establish communications had been crucial in resolving the crisis. The three pilots had formed an unlikely friendship, bonded by their shared experience. The technical innovations that emerged from Sarah's improvised solutions had been incorporated into new training programs. Military engineers had developed improved emergency communication systems based on her use of flares and smoke markers. The laser writing technique she had demonstrated was now taught as a backup communication method for situations where radio contact was impossible. Sarah's Apache, tail number 0703058, had been fully repaired and returned to service. The helicopter bore no visible scars from its desert adventure, but its maintenance records told the story of an aircraft that had been pushed far beyond normal operational limits. Sarah remained its primary pilot, and their partnership had become legendary among ground crews and support personnel. The mining road where she had landed had been surveyed and officially designated as an emergency landing site for military aircraft. A small marker had been placed there, not for public recognition but as a reminder to military personnel that solutions could be found in the most unlikely places. The site was now used for emergency landing training exercises. Sergeant Rodriguez had been promoted and transferred to a communications intelligence unit, where his experience with jamming and interference made him invaluable in developing countermeasures. His quick thinking in identifying the Apache during the crisis had been credited as a key factor in preventing the tragedy. He often served as a guest instructor in Sarah's training programs. The enemy jamming operation had been dismantled within weeks of its discovery, but the incident had exposed serious vulnerabilities in military communication systems. New encryption methods and backup identification protocols had been implemented across all branches of service. The lessons learned from Sarah's experience had made the entire military more resilient against electronic warfare attacks. Sarah's grandfather had lived to see her receive the Distinguished Flying Cross, though he passed away quietly in his sleep just 2 months later. At his funeral, she wore her dress uniform with its new decoration, knowing that he would have been proud of how she had honored the warrior traditions he had taught her. His final words to her had been about the importance of finding joy even in the darkest moments. The laughter that had echoed across the radio frequencies during the crisis had become something of a legend in military aviation circles. Audio recordings of Sarah's transmission were sometimes played during training sessions as an example of maintaining composure under extreme pressure. New pilots learned that sometimes the most effective communication was not what you said, but how you said it. Sarah continued flying Apache missions, but her perspective had been forever changed by the incident. She understood now that the most dangerous enemy was often miscommunication and misunderstanding rather than hostile forces. Her training programs emphasized the importance of creative thinking and multiple backup plans for every conceivable scenario. The fighter pilots who had pursued her that day became frequent visitors to her training courses. Major Johnson often told his students that he had learned more about flying from being outmaneuvered by a helicopter than from shooting down enemy jets. The mutual respect between fixed-wing and rotary-wing pilots had deepened as a result of their shared experience. Years later, when asked about the most important lesson from that day in the desert, Sarah would always return to her grandfather's wisdom about finding strength in laughter, the ability to maintain hope and humor in the face of seemingly impossible odds had not only saved her life but had transformed a potential disaster into a triumph of human ingenuity and military professionalism. The sky above the desert where it all happened remained unchanged, vast and eternal. But for those who knew the story, it would forever echo with the sound of laughter and the memory of the day when one pilot's creativity and courage had prevented tragedy and redefined what was possible in the realm of military aviation. The legend of Thunder Martinez had begun with an equipment malfunction and a case of mistaken identity, but it had evolved into something much larger, a testament to the power of human adaptability and the unbreakable spirit of those who choose to serve. In military tradition, Every great story becomes part of the larger narrative of service and sacrifice. Sarah's adventure had earned its place in that honored collection, ensuring that future generations of pilots would know that sometimes the greatest victories come not from weapons or technology, but from the courage to laugh in the face of the impossible, and the wisdom to find solutions where none seemed to exist.